there, welcome back to the Schwobo studio at Columbus State University's Schwob School of Music. Where we left off last, we shaped and tied some cane and tied on this reed and did just a little bit of scraping on the outer tip so we could set it overnight. So we were encouraging the closure of the reed and the aperture to be small because we don't want it to pop open and be ginormous. So we are picking up from that point. So before we're going to clip this reed open, which is going to take a little while, we are going to continue our scraping in the tip, and then we'll put in some long channels in the back, and then we're actually going to let it sit overnight another night. Okay, so we're going to mark in our little bottom corners of our peak, and in the Schwobo studio we call these the armpits. So we're going to mark in where our little armpits are going to go, and our measurements here, we put those in at 66. So I'm just going to make a little mark on the side, and then I'll show you a little trick here. So I actually just kind of connect over the side of the reed, because any pencil you put right here is going to get scraped away pretty quickly, so you always have that reference point of the pencil on the side of the reed. So just a little bit of review of what we're thinking about here. We've got two angles of our knife. Okay, so the first angle that we have to think about is whether the knife is sort of flat on the piece of cane or tilted and angled out to the side. So in a lot of the scraping that we're going to do, especially in the tip, we want the knife angled towards the side, and that's going to leave us with some thickness and some spine in the middle of the tip, which is a really good thing. It's going to build in some focus into our sound. So that's the first angle. And then the second angle is the angle of our peak. So if we scrape flat this way, we'll end up with a peak with no altitude. And so we want to have a peak. I like peaks with kind of medium altitude. I don't like them to be too tall, and I don't like them to be too flat. So I'm thinking about angling my knife based on the altitude of the peak that I want in my spine. So as I scrape my tip further, I'm going to be thinking about those two different angles. So here I'd like to start thinking more about the metered scrape, and what I mean by that is I've got my two knife angles set up, and I'm going to start way back here at my pencil line for my armpit, and I'm going to take one full scrape off the left quadrant of the reed and go all the way off the tip. Then my next scrape, I'm going to start, I don't know, maybe a millimeter or so in front of that pencil line, and again scrape diagonally all the way off the corner, start another millimeter higher, so on and so on and so on. So what happens is we build thickness, we like grade from thick out to thin on the corner, which builds in good structure in the tip. And by every scrape coming off the very end of the tip, we're going to avoid what we call in the oboe studio the ka-chunk, which is the little hard speed bump that we often get at the very tip of the reed. So we try to eliminate that as soon as possible. So I'm going to do one more little round here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I'm going to come over to this side. Still thinking about those same two angles. I'm just shifting to the right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I got to do two groupings here. So if you notice, I'm counting my scrapes, and I'm doing the same number in each quadrant, because symmetry in our reeds is really important. So I have to do one more round on each side here. So I've done about 10 or so scrapes in each quadrant, and then sometimes I just come to the outer tip and make sure that there really isn't any ka-chunk there in the middle. Okay, so we're going to take a peek at the profile. So we're looking for a nice taper that takes us from the heart through to the outer tip. So that metered scrape really encourages the reed to do that. So that's going to ensure that our outer tip is the most thin part of the reed. So we're looking for that taper, and I check in with the profile often. And when I look at my students' reeds, that's one of the first things I look at. I first assess the profile, and then I look at the aperture. And we'll start looking at the aperture just as soon as we clip this reed open. So we've done some good scraping in the tip, and now I think we need to balance the rest of the reed just a little bit. So our next plan, are we still good? Mm-hmm. Is we're gonna put in some long channels into the rest of the reed. So we're not thinking about separating the heart from the back just yet. We're just creating long channels. And so it's good to measure, but I've done this long enough that I know pretty much the space that I want from the thread down at the bottom. But just so you can have a measurement, it's about 3 or 4 millimeters from the thread where I start this initial scrape. So this scrape, I'm looking to stay right in the middle of each channel. So I don't want to scrape on the rail and I don't want to scrape right on the spine. And so if you'll notice while I'm scraping, a couple of things here. I am not actually moving my right hand very much. I'm actually moving the reed and my left hand to get the knife to scrape on the cane. And notice that kind of gives me some good control. If I were to move my right hand, I would have to kind of do this big swoop and this big swing with the knife. And I found that when you do that, you really lose control over where the knife is taking cane off of the reed. So I keep the knife kind of still, and I've got this back thumb for support. And I'm also keeping the knife perpendicular to the surface of the cane. I don't want to come into a parallel sort of position here. So just kind of taking a long scrape forward. So I think maybe that was 3 or 4. I'd usually do 1. So I need to come on this side and do the same amount. So notice how much I'm moving the left hand and how much I'm not moving the right hand. So flip the reed over. And then 1 more. And essentially, I am going to do this until, let's see if we can get a close-up of. So here, what I'm looking for, my channels aren't perfect yet, but they've just been barely started, so they'll get straighter and cleaner the more I scrape in the channels. But what I'm looking for, if you notice, the rails and down here, we still have that shiny bark. And we've taken the shiny bark off, and now we sort of get into a more cloudy layer of cane. So what we're going to do is scrape past that cloudy layer where it doesn't get shiny again, but it gets really smooth and it loses that cloudy sort of milky color. So I'm going to keep going with that scrape until I'm going to scrape until I can get that cloudy layer off. So I'm going to just continue with my rounds of 3 in each quadrant. My teacher used to comment about how scraping here, the cane kind of rolls off the reed as if you were rolling up a sleeping bag. I always liked that analogy. One thing I should also mention is that my knife is really sharp, and so I'm using the sharpness of the knife to take the cane off the reed. I'm not using a lot of pressure with my right hand to press into the reed. So you want to make sure that your knife is really sharp. And we've covered knife sharpening in a different segment, or we will. That will be done. All right, so let's just check in. We're getting there. I'm still going to take a few more scrapes, but let's just check in with what our channels are looking like. You'll notice that the milky layer is starting to get cleared up, and that cane in the channels is starting to look smooth, and you can almost see the little grains running through the cane. So I'm going to do just a little bit more because it still feels pretty thick back there. Check my knife to make sure it's still sharp. And here I'm going to start to pay a little closer attention to make sure my spine is straight, and I'm really trying to make some nice clean straight rails. can really start to see all those little grains becoming much clearer. And one more side. Okay, so let's just get a shot of the profile. So it looks similar. We've just taken some cane off of the rest of the reed now, but we still have that taper going from all of this to the outer tip, and we want to maintain that. I'm going to scrape just a little bit more, just to get a little more bulk out of the rest of the reed, and just a little bit more out of the tip, because this will be where we let it sit for one more night to continue to encourage the aperture to be a little more on the closed side rather than on the open side. And that's something that works for us here in Columbus, Georgia. We tend to have reeds with bigger openings. It's very humid down here, and we are pretty much at sea level, so our reeds don't have any trouble staying open. I am going to sharpen my knife real quick. So this is where I would put the little reed to sleep for one more night, and then coming back to it in the morning, I'd probably touch up everything that I just did and then clip it open and see where we are. So the amount that I do in the blank scrape before I clip the reed open, my hope is that the reed will be fairly close to a C and where I want it when I clip it open. So I try to do enough scraping that there'll be some vibrations when we clip the reed open, and it won't be so hard and feel like two popsicle sticks.